Hello, Mr. Roberts.
Hello.
How are you? Great. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. Thank you for asking. And how are all of you? And who are all of you? And where are all of you?
My name is Youngjun, and I'm first year master student. I'm in Rochester right now, and maybe Bonnie.
Hi, I'm Bonnie. I'm Yibing Qian and I go by Bonnie. I'm in China right now. I'm a senior composition student.
Nice.
Hi, I'm Ethan. I'm studying at Eastman in person, and I'm a first year undergraduate composition student.
Great. Are you in the Eastman dorm?
Yes.
I have lived there at one time. I think I recognize it.
So first of all, thank you for joining us on behalf of Eastman Composition Department and students for today. And we will start some questions about your pieces that you shared with us. And Bonnie will start some questions about the field of light.
Hi.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi, so let's start the piece Flitter Light. The first question is, you said that you were inspired by how the natural intersects with the city, and it was very interesting that you started from sunlight, dancing, texture to aggressive rhythmic music. Your use of texture in this piece is fascinating and really brought me into the atmosphere of the natural world. Could you elaborate on how you approach writing the piece, or more generally, how you choose to utilize texture in your works?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, Bonnie. Thank you. So this was, first of all, I'll give you a little more background about the project, which was also very Eastman based. I don't know how much you know about this project, but it was spearheaded by a flute player who I think did her doctorate at Eastman and wanted to do named Emlyn Johnson. I don't know if you know Emlyn, or if maybe some of you were there when she was still there, but she wanted to do this project to celebrate the national parks of the United States a couple of years ago when it was the centennial celebration of the National Parks Association. And so she got a grant and commissioned 10 composers, I think it was 10 or maybe even more than 10, to write pieces celebrating the national parks of the United States. And I was one of the composers asked. I think all of the composers had some tie to Eastman. So that's also kind of an interesting Eastman pride note. But many of them, like myself, had not been at Eastman for a while already. So some of the connections were a little bit looser than others. And I was living in New York City at the time when I was asked to write the piece and didn't have a lot of direct contact with national parks. So it was an interesting project for me to think about my relationship to national parks, which at the time was not very visceral for me. It was hard for me to have an embodied experience in a national park at that time. But I lived on the Upper West Side of New York City, and I was very close to both Riverside and Central Parks, which is my favorite thing about that area of the city. I think a lot of people choose to live on the Upper West Side because of the parks. I mean, it's one of the great things that you have access to these parks. And so I thought a lot about the experience and the importance of parks in New York City, and how when you're running around the city and then you walk into a park, it can feel like an oasis. And also the juxtaposition between the city and the park can be so sharp, because I mean, Central Park West is this avenue that just literally separates buildings from park. It's just one hard line of experience that separates. I mean, there's this line, then you're in the park and then you're not. Also, the park is man-made. It's very beautiful, but it's man-made. It's not like a national park. So there were a lot of things I was thinking about how humans and nature intersect in this experience, and the importance of parks in the city. And I wanted to pay tribute to that complex experience. But in terms of actually writing the piece, so yes, as you mentioned in my note for the piece, I talked about wanting to have contrasting textures or musics that represented the park and also the city. And so the rhythmic music is more of my city music, and the beginning textural music is more of the nature music. And I think the word texture, you're right, is extremely important to me. I think as composers, we all have starting points where we, operate from when we write a piece of music. And for me, the starting point very often is texture. And when I say texture, I always like to clarify what I mean by that term, because texture also has these historical associations and like contrapuntal terms of how many voices you're using, like a 2-voice texture versus a 3-voice texture. I don't mean that at all. I mean the texture, like the touch, the quality of like the fabric you might be touching, or the quality of, for example, I've always been attracted, for example, to Van Gogh's paintings because the brush strokes are so palpable. So for me, just the quality of how the material feels is a really, really important starting point. I like to music for me is very physical. The way that I feel music is very physical. And so I like to have a sense for the physicality of that music. And I should also like to say that I like to have a very wide range sometimes of kinds of touch in my music. So the beginning music, which is a representation in some ways of, I had an image, for example, of light filtering through the leaves of a tree, which is, I'm sure you can experience if you're in Rochester right now. It's a beautiful time of year to experience that. But to give a way to represent that delicately, that kind of delicacy of experience, of just sort of just light sort of drifting through leaves, or just kind of the wind drifting through leaves. And so some of the materials that I wanted to pick to sort of embody this were materials, things like bowing, rapidly circular bowing on a string instrument, which creates this vibrating sound. Some of these timbral oscillations are like a quiet flutter tongue. Some of these sounds to me were really important for representing some of that delicacy of energy. And conversely, when I got to the rhythmic music, I'm sure you can hear, but having these much more aggressive attacks in the string instruments, and a lot of course, the percussion leads the segue into the rhythmic music. So having the percussion be much more heavily involved in that music as well, in terms of, I guess the percussion is probably involved in the beginning as well, but more for these delicate cymbal rolls. And I can't even remember without looking at the score exactly how I orchestrated it, but some of these, I think of percussion often as offering these different experiences. There's the atmospheric experiences of cymbal rolls and maybe light maraca shakers, some of these sort of background drony sounds that we can make with percussion. And then of course we also have drumming, which is much more, which is what I used for the more percussive, aggressive, angular music of the city.
Okay. So you mentioned about the percussion in this piece, and I noticed you assigned desk bells for horn towards the end of the piece for this piece, and I found that very interesting. Have you ever given simple percussion like instruments to non-percussionists to use in a given piece?
I don't think I have, and that was probably a very practical reason. I think the percussionist is probably busy at that time, right? So it was probably just because I couldn't get the percussionist to do everything, and maybe the horn didn't have anything to do at the time. Also, I should say that the desk bells were not a set of instruments that I had used before, but the percussionist for the ensemble had a set. And so when they sent us a list of what they could use, that was an option. And so I got excited about the desk bells for that piece.
Okay. So let's move to another question. Like, I know you said in your website that your music is not generally programmatic. Could you explain a little bit for us, like who you build up the form on this piece?
You mean the form of filtered light, or just generally about programmatic music?
Both, if you can to share.
Yeah, I think for me, my first very powerful experiences of music when I was like a young person were just more about the abstract, visceral and emotional experiences of music. And I never, when I learned about sort of extra musical stories about pieces, I never really cared that much about, about that kind of information if the music didn't already have a direct impact on me. Part of the reason why I think I love music so much is it kind of bypasses the linguistic part of the sort of thought center of the brain and hits you very directly. So, I'm always interested in like the combination of meanings, if there's like a text, and the kind of meanings that can arise when there's the relationship of the text and the music. But first and foremost, I need to feel that I have a connection to the music itself. And that's what I mean when usually there's not an extra musical meaning for my pieces apart from just the dynamic and interrelationship of the parts of the piece itself. But of course, I'm saying that at the same time that I'm telling you that for this piece, I had these associations with parks. And so there were these outside meanings, but it's not programmatic in the sense of telling a specific story. It's more of kind of the experience of the city and parks kind of inspiring thoughts or ideas about different kinds of textures that I could then use to make the piece. Not so much that I'm trying to tell a specific story about Central Park. For example, I was just teaching my freshmen actually the other day about Central Park in the Dark. Do you guys all know that piece by Charles Ives? That's another great New York City park piece. And that's a very, very specific piece that has a lot of very specific imagery. So maybe that could be used as a contrasting example to mine, where my imagery isn't so specific. It's more generated by the experience of the idea of the park and the city, but I'm not trying to really point out specific images in that way. Although, as I mentioned about one of my other pieces that I dropped in the folder, my saxophone concerto, that is the one piece that I've written recently that is very explicitly programmatic. So I shouldn't say I never do it.
Okay. The last question is kind of a general question. I remember that you said that the stacked fifth harmonies indicates a small nod to American music in this piece. Is there any other pieces that you use this chord to indicate American natural or American aesthetics?
Oh, that's a nice question too. I think in some ways I was very conscious about that, because that particular sound of the stacked fifths is not one that maybe I use in a lot of other pieces. So when I did find myself using it, to me it felt like I was a bit conscious of the associations I have with that sound, and it did make me think of composers like Aaron Copland, or maybe I have a lot of John Luther Adams music in my inner ear right now, because I direct the new music ensemble at Kent State where I teach, and we're doing a John Luther Adams piece right now. And so there are these composers who use these kind of open diatonic-y kind of stacked sounds, that stacked fifth sounds, maybe open interval sounds, to represent a sense of open plain or pastoral American quality. And I was just aware of that association as I used it. So that was conscious for me when I was using that harmony, as opposed to some of my other chords, which probably have just as many associations with other composers, but they're a little bit more integrated into my regular usage. So I don't feel as kind of self-conscious about their use.
So these are all questions about this piece. The next piece I want to ask is about the oboe quartet. I love the timbres and use of extended techniques in your music. For the second movement of your oboe quartet, were you influenced by any particular works by Bach or any other composers? Because I thought this movement sounds like really different in style compared to the other movements of this quartet.
Yes, I was definitely thinking about Bach, although not necessarily specific works. It was more the idea of like the lament bass, just this four-note falling bass figure, and also the direct use of triadic tonality, which, I mean, I'm not using really functional tonality, but I mean, it starts with a C minor triad. So for me, that was also something that maybe felt just like the Copland quote. I guess this is kind of a similar topic. I mean, it's not a quote, but the Copland reference really, it's sort of a similar topic, I guess, of the idea of kind of playing with signs, where you're using things that might fall outside of your kind of organically developed language on purpose, that evoke something in you, that you have a direct relationship, but you're aware that these signs also live in some other repertoire more organically than they might in your own repertoire. And there are plenty of composers who use triads all the time, so for whom triads are really, really organic. But for my music, in the way that I developed as a composer, using that language definitely felt like a self-conscious, reference to Bach and to this older style. And it was interesting for me to Well, I think writing that particular piece, one thing that was interesting is because I knew it was going to be paired with the Mozart Oboe Quartet. So my head was in this space of thinking about how can I reference or sort of think about classical music with a capital C as kind of as a way of dialoguing with classical music as a capital C. Because as composers, sometimes we're trying to push away from classical music, sometimes we're leaning towards it, and we can have changing and different relationships to classical music, right? So for me, I kind of embraced both ways of making my piece sound close to it while highlighting a lot of differences as well. So I mean, as you can hear, I adopted a very classical framework in terms of these three movements of fast, slow, fast. But of course, within the movements, the materials themselves sometimes sound very noisy and not at all like classical music, and sometimes they directly reference classical music. And I think, just like I was talking about this wide range of textures that I enjoy playing with, from the very delicate to the more aggressive, I think I sort of enjoyed in that piece setting up this spectrum of references of these materials that sound, these sort of extended techniques that you talked about that sound very of our time, and also these materials that sound older. And the interplay between all of these things was kind of an exciting framework to set up for myself to work in.
And the use of multiphonics in this piece strikes me as very natural and blended with the string texture. Did you know ahead of time that it would sound this way, or did it come naturally as you were writing this?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I was pleasantly surprised. I think I kind of hoped it would blend very, very well. I think this kind of writing is something that I probably have stolen from ideas from spectral music, which is music that I like very much, although I wouldn't call myself in any way like a spectral composer, but specifically this idea of using, thinking about a spectrum of sound, of harmonic sound to noisy sound, and having material be able to dissolve from a sense of pitched or harmonic state of being or listening to a sense of noisy materials where the sense of harmony dissolves. And also emotionally, I find that kind of, you can kind of lean into this sense of things kind of becoming more distorted and then coming back into a sense of pitch. And so that concept is one that I sort of found in spectral music and have used within my music. And so in that particular case, for example, on strings, using the overpressure, starting with a sense of normal pitch and then leaning into overpressure, was a similar way of thinking about the oboe, starting with the regular note and then leaning into either like a flutter tongue or a multiphonic. To me, that was kind of an analogous technique. So yeah, I was hoping to blend those sounds and from that particular point of view.
The last thing I was curious about, how you organize these movements and how does the form take shape in this piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think the movements are organized kind of, there's nothing really more complex to say than maybe the fast, slow, fast that I talked about. I think that, and there is a sense of, if I remember correctly, there is some sort of loose sense of return at the end of each movement. It's certainly not like a simple ABA, but I did think about some kind of way of returning to some kind of like remembrance of the opening music at some point in each of the movements. So that was also kind of a way of engaging with these paradigms from classical form. Some of my pieces don't do that. They just move, in one direction and are always evolving. But this particular piece, I think, again, I like the idea of taking some things from classical music and then writing my own music within those frameworks. Sometimes when things are close, it actually allows you to observe more differences also. So you could see which parts are similar, and it would actually highlight the differences between other parts of my language and the parts that resembled classical music. So again, I think it was part of that conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you for the great questions, Bonnie.
We can move on to the questions about the Book of Doubt, Book of Fate, which was very interesting title, by the way, and as well as Nostalgia Variation, because some students were also, and I personally also had some questions about variation as well. So Ethan will elaborate and ask you about those questions.
Yes, so I loved listening to both of these pieces. And similar to the last question about organization and form, I mean, this is sort of related, but how did you approach writing the Book of Faith? Like, were you thinking about specific things like intervals or harmonic clusters? Were you thinking about the lines and the vocal parts? Like, how did you incorporate these things in the piece?
Yeah, so maybe I can also give a little background context to that piece, because I think that, from my experience, each one of these situations that you find yourself in when you're asked to write a piece, I like the challenge of responding to the situation. Like I was talking about how the first piece we talked about was a response to this idea of thinking about national parks, and the oboe quartet was in response to thinking about in some way the relationship of my piece to knowing that it would be programmed alongside the Mozart oboe quartet. So I'm realizing that, again, maybe while I don't really write programmatic music, maybe that's a little bit misleading, because all these associations are meaningful to me about the specific context I'm in when I'm writing. So with this piece, I was commissioned to write this piece for a concert that I knew would also include Morton Feldman's Rothko Chapel. Do you all know that piece?
I don't know that piece.
I think you would really like it, Ethan, if you liked my piece. It's one of my favorite pieces. I mean, I love Morton Feldman's music in general very much, and it's just a really beautiful, interesting piece. So maybe go check that piece out. And it was also going to be on the same program with David Lang's Little Match Girl Passion as well. So I knew that there were these two really great pieces on the program, and I knew that I also, interestingly, had this instrumentation available to me to work with of Morton Feldman's instrumentation if I wanted to, which is a bit of an odd instrumentation. I mean, it's percussion and viola and choir. So it's a really beautiful instrumentation, but not one that you come across every day. And I love the viola very much. So that was, I was happy about having the viola and the percussion available to me to work with. I didn't have to use them, but I decided to. And it was a really also tight time frame for me to write this piece, because my wife was pregnant at the time with our twin babies, and when my friend Alex, who works for YIVO, the Center for Jewish Research in New York, called me to ask me if I'd write this piece, I said I'd love to, but is there any way I could do it like next year, because my wife is going to give birth in like a month and a half, and this is going to be really intense for me to try to get this done in like a matter of a few months, basically. And he said, no, we have this funding for this project and we have to do it right now. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. So I immediately went to this friend of mine named Claire Schwartz, who's this amazing poet. And I said, Claire, would you write me some poems? And she said, okay. And I said, I need them done like tomorrow, basically. So, because I need to start working on this piece. So it was a very, very tight, compressed time frame. And we talked about the idea of what would it be like to write psalm-length poems that don't really reference God specifically, and that are kind of maybe feminist or some newer interpretation of Psalms of this time. And she was excited about the idea, and we were on this schedule where she started sending me basically one a week. And I got this first one, and it just kind of blew my mind open. I thought these poems were just absolutely amazing. They told sort of a story of the Jewish people, but in a very, very abstract way that to me, the language just spoke beautifully to me. They were wide open in terms of the way that you could interpret them. And it just was one of these kind of synchronous things where you didn't know what you were going to get when you asked this person, and then what they gave you was something that just kind of, sparked all these things for me. So I felt very lucky that it worked out that way. And, I also love the title of the piece, and I'm going to say that without feeling like I'm bragging, because it's her title. I just stole it. So I often struggle with titles for my pieces. And when you work with a poet, you can just use, their skill for language, in lieu of your own. So that was very nice for me. To answer your question about the specific materials of the piece, yes, there are tone clusters. I think in the beginning, if I can just maybe speak about a few specific moments, in the beginning of the piece, I just started singing the poem to myself and ended up coming with that first line. And I like very much this kind of sense of extended diatonic harmony where you can hear some references to maybe a background collection, but then you break it. It's not a straight collection that you know. So I often look for these juicy intervals where you can start with a set that you like and then break it with another interval. And that's basically how I constructed this first set. And then the other thing that I carefully played with, because I had 16 singers, was how I was going to sustain and hold each of the notes. Because, you know, the very first sound that you hear is a minor second that's sustained, and it's kind of a sharp sound. But then when the other intervals enter, it warms up into this, you know, kind of fatter cluster. And as the repetitions happen, I sustained some, and I was careful. It was an interesting work to layer the entrances and the exits of each of the voices so that this cluster would remain sounding, but also have kind of ebbs and flows to it. So that's some of the thinking that I was, you know, doing when I was working on that movement. And then also, of course, the vibraphone doesn't enter for the first chunk of the first movement. So when it does enter, it makes an impression. And some of the other things I was thinking of are very similar to the ideas that we were talking about when I was talking about texture earlier. Like there's a moment later in the first movement where they get to the chord where they're saying the C, and I get to this big chord, and then it was nice for me to be able to think about how to articulate the chord with repetitions of the C, the C, the C, the C. Different singers say the C, but they're holding the pitches that they're holding within this chord so that the harmony remains constant, but you hear it activated with these timbral colorations of just the S's and the word the, which also makes its own sound. So I was thinking a lot about these timbral fluctuations and clusters and harmony and how they would all come together in this overall texture.
Wow. Thank you so much for answering that. That's super interesting to me. But I have a question now on the nostalgia variations. And it's about your form. It's sort of similar, but like the traditional theme, it's a very old form, theme and variations. And how did you combine like modern compositional techniques with this older form? And when you're composing music that's like this, that's like a form that's like a theme and variations, like combining older and more modern compositional techniques, what are some of the challenges that you have in this process? How do you overcome them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first response to that for me is that probably until I was about 30, and I just turned 40. So probably until I was about 30, I wouldn't have done this kind of piece, maybe even a little bit after 30. I was much more of a, let's say, a straight up modernist, where the idea of sort of the mess of these different associations was not so appealing to me. But I think the title of the word nostalgia for me is a sense also of missing. There was something at that time when I felt like it was important for me. I was missing kind of music with a capital M. And Nostalgia Variations, of course, was 2015, and then the Oboe Quartet was 2016, 17. So during that specific set of years, especially, I was looking for ways to integrate some of these things, you know, and even like the idea of tonality as a topic, you know, to kind of use in your music, but not to write tonal music, was something that I was kind of curious about. So also, I think there's something about C minor, but also that piece starts with a little bit of a C minor and a C minor collection. But of course, right from the very, even in the theme, I'm using slap tongues in the bass clarinet and these sort of accented hits in the marimba that aren't totally, you know, the language and the feel of the music is not something that an older composer, I think, would have done. But the first real response to your question, Ethan, is that part of why I think I've enjoyed working in this way is that I embrace the mess of it. Like I like the mess of it, actually. I like the mess of associations of some of the newer techniques and some of the older sounds. So I actually haven't felt that the answer is that I have to resolve it all, but I actually just sort of like the mess of, like, for example, you know, I like, for example, like 90s hip hop, but that's also because I'm like of a certain age when I like was learning about hip hop, I learned about like 90s hip hop, and now I don't really listen to hip hop from the last 5 years that much. So I know like this one little repertoire of hip hop that maybe other people know or don't know. And that's just sort of part of who I am now. Like, you know, we all have different things that we have absorbed at different times. And part of me was sort of accepting these different kind of associations that are important to me. Like, I grew up playing the piano, so I have all of this European classical music, like piano music and chamber music and things like that in my system. But then I also love, you know, extended this, you know, composers who write more extended techniques. And so how do I integrate all of this information? Do I just try to ignore parts of myself and just, you know, there was this idea for, you know, a long time in the 20th century of progress, right? That you were always supposed to look forward and, you know, write something more advanced or more complicated maybe than the past composer. You know, Boulez came along and said Schoenberg was dead. That was one attitude that we could take, you know, but for me, that attitude felt a little limited and not necessarily true to my own path, I think, at that time. So I was looking to integrate things that I loved from our time, some of these textures, some of these extended techniques and textures and complicated sounds, with some of these other sounds that were also very organic and deep within me. And so this piece was, I think, a way of trying to deal with some of these seemingly irreconcilable differences, you know, and whether they actually get resolved or not, I have no idea. You know, that's maybe in the ear of the listener, you know, the ear of the beholder. I don't know if they actually get resolved. And I don't think my task in the piece was to try to resolve them. It was more to set up a situation where I could play with all of these things in one piece. So as you listen to the piece, of course, some of the moments are much wilder and much more like, you know, what we would just say is like sort of clean contemporary music. And some of it sounds older and hence the word nostalgia. And I like that fluctuation of associations. It was, for me, felt important to work within that fluctuation of associations.
Great, thank you so much. For these crazy sections and where there's where you really there's a lot of changes in range for the bass clarinet when you go up really, really high. Is it a challenge for you, like when working with the performer and knowing what specifically they're capable of? Because like different bass clarinet players might like have different preferences for range and what techniques work easy for them. So what's your process for like working with like performers and knowing what they're capable of?
So I knew I was working with this group, Transient Canvas. Do you guys know them? They're a very active bass clarinet marimba duo, and they've commissioned a lot of pieces, probably like close to 100 at this time. I don't know how many exactly, but so I knew I was working with Amy Advocate, this amazing clarinet player. So I could work with her pretty closely on this stuff. But the main way that I try to work is I just write what I want, knowing that I probably will write something impossible and that I might have to revise it later. And so the important part of that for me is that I go into working with the performer knowing that if I don't play their instrument, which is most of the instruments in the world, that I just know that they're going to be more of an expert than I am on what's possible. And then, you know, I go in there not with this attitude, well, I'm the composer, make it happen, but rather, you know, let's have a conversation about what works, and I'm open to trying to, you know, revise something if I need to. Of course, there are also moments, and you have to have your antenna up for these, you know, when a performer says they can't do something, but if you push them, they can. I mean, there are a lot of stories in the history of music where a piece was deemed impossible at first, only to become standard repertoire a few years later, a generation later. So sometimes insisting is the right thing, and then sometimes revising is the right thing. But being open to working in that way is the way that I approach. I focus first on trying to get what I want in my inner ear onto the page.
Thank you.
So I can ask you about what you just said about like your inner ear into the page. So when you're writing and when you're actually hearing the pieces that you wrote for the first time, was there a moment that you were very surprised about it, or how do you actually reduce the gap between your imagination and what's actually generating on the performance?
Yeah, I mean, that's the ongoing struggle for composers, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. I think with these particular pieces, I don't think there were, I think, I mean, I'm a little far away now. I'm 3-4 years out from some of these pieces, so I can't remember my exact reactions, but probably some of the textures in the choir piece were probably the most surprising because I have probably the least amount of experience of writing for choir than some of the other situations. I've written a lot for instruments, you know, all sorts of, all the, you know, orchestral instruments. So I think probably for the instrumental pieces, I probably wasn't surprised as much, but there are always little surprises here and there. Sometimes very pleasant surprises, sometimes unpleasant surprises. And yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to the question is just experience, right? I mean, the more we all write, the more we can have our music performed. I mean, what a lucky thing to be at Eastman where you have these amazing performers to play your music, because if they're good performers, then you have a very accurate, you can trust that you're hearing what it will sound like in the hands of a good performer. And then you can trust that if something doesn't sound right, it might be something that you need to consider revising. So it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to be in such a great environment with so many great people around you, I think. By the way, just as an aside, I'll say that Eastman was probably the happiest time of my life, and I've been miserable ever since I left. So enjoy it while you're there.
No more questions about about the Eastman life as well at the back. But before we get to that point, I would like to ask you some questions about diptych, which I really loved for the string, the violin and string instruments. First of all, I remember that you elaborate your program note in the diptych that it's like two complementary panels rather than movements. Can you elaborate a little bit more about it?
Yeah, for me, that was an interesting thing to think about because, first of all, two movement forms, if we want to call them movements for a second, are quite rare in music history. There's something about the idea of having a third movement that seems for a lot of composers to have rounded things out, or even a fourth movement, right? So the idea of two movements, I think, are two pieces kind of highlighting the stark contrast between these movements without having a third movement to continue the conversation or to resolve something that happened in the other two movements. And I did like the idea of imagining them as just paintings or some kind of panels hanging side by side, which suggests that you're sort of perceiving them in a way that you can't perceive music, right? That you're perceiving them atemporally, outside of time, that you could just hold all of the differences and contrasts in your mind at one time without having to hear it from left to right. And in a way, these two movements are a little imbalanced, right? First of all, the first movement is shorter. And also, I hear the way that the pieces or panels operate as being different as well. I mean, the second movement, I keep calling it a movement, even though I claimed it wasn't a movement, but the second panel, excuse me, let me try to not contradict myself too much. The second panel is much more developmental. I mean, it has a sense of teleology or forward motion and trajectory, where for me, the first movement is more of an less of an out of time experience. There's still lines moving places, but I hear it more as an experience of sound, of just sitting in a sound. And the second movement as more of a journey. I guess I'm just going to call them movements. So, so yeah, I did like, again, I think one thing, as I'm hearing myself talk, I can say that I guess in each of these situations, I try to find something that feels like it's intriguing to me, right? Like the relationship of the oboe quartet to classical music, or in this case, the idea of these two panels that are a little imbalanced. I like these situations that create a problem for me that's a little intriguing, or something to chew on that's a little intriguing, or the idea, as Ethan brought up, of reconciling older forms with newer materials. Each one of these problems I find to be very creatively helpful. Like it gives me something to think about and chew on.
So for those two panels, I was able to see like what you actually mentioned. At the beginning of the interview, for example, the first movement, I could hear all these influences by Morton Feldman, and the second movement, I was able to hear your fond love about the textures. In the second movement specifically, I was able to find out all these ascending scales that those two string instruments were generating. And I found out it's very interesting. Can you explain a little bit more how you build up those textures, how you choose those pitch material, or how you align with one texture to another? Can you explain a little bit more about your process?
Yeah, so I think in that particular movement, one of the things, as maybe you can tell, I sort of like some of these contradictory things like I've talked about, these contradictory situations. And one thing that I liked about the contradictory thing about that piece was the idea of simplicity to complexity, that spectrum. So on the one hand, the materials are very, very simple. They're just these 4-note figures. And on the other hand, I found that with these 4-note figures, I can try to build these more complex tapestries of experience of sound, right? So that was kind of where I was going. And part of what I was thinking about was also tempo and speed. Like there are sort of ordinary tempos that we all absorb from classical music or from other kinds of music. But then what happens if you go past those ordinary tempos on either side, tempi? If you go too slow, for example, the composer Grisey talked about whale time and insect time. Like if you stretch time, it becomes very, very slow and long. So what if you just take these 4-note figure and you slow it down so that it slowly builds up into just a cluster, which is how I start the piece. And then what if that starts to speed up and becomes so fast that it dissolves into a texture that you can't really hear the notes anymore? So I like this spectrum of speed also as a way of creating texture. The other thing that I was thinking about harmonically was something else that I've thought about in my relationship to spectral music. And again, I've just sort of stolen little things from spectral music, but I very much like sometimes the experience of a microtone in a texture. And my music doesn't use them everywhere, but for example, I sometimes think about, and I have to pay tribute to where it's due. I studied with the composer Julian Anderson. I don't know if you know his music, but it was an important composer to learn from. And part of what I learned from him was his thinking about spectral music, because he was very much interested in composers like Mirai and Grisey, but ended up coming up with, in a way, if I may say so, I don't know if he would call it this, but I think a much more pragmatic approach to using some of these materials, because when you have so many microtones in some of these scores, sometimes you don't even know what the instrumentals are actually even playing. Are they really in tune? And what he sort of discovered for himself that I've kind of adopted also for some situations in my music is that sometimes by just using one microtone in a texture, it can really color the entire texture by creating a certain vibrating beating that doesn't happen with just equal temperament. So sometimes I think about the overtone series, for example, and I just think about 8, 9, 10, 11 partials, or 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. If you just think about those, maybe up to 13, if you can take the 7th, 11th, and 13th partials and tune them to microtones, like, the 11th partial is really very close to an exact quarter step. So for example, if I have the notes C, D, E, F quarter sharp, that could be an approximation of the 8, 9, 10, 11 partials with the bass C. And so that creates for me this beautiful 4-note cluster that sounds very familiar because it's almost like a diatonic cluster, but a little bit novel or different from just a diatonic cluster. And that kind of sonority is something that my ear has been very attracted to. So in the opening of that piece, I use a lot of these diatonic, but sort of microtonal clusters, and then I shift centers. So those were some of the things that I was thinking about in that particular piece. And also I had this image in my mind that I don't know if it was at the beginning of writing the piece, but maybe sometime after I started writing it, of being kind of like a basket weaver or something like that, where you would take this very small cell and then weave it into these more complex, baskets. Or it felt very much like doing handiwork in that way.
For me, it felt like, as you just mentioned, it starts from the little material to that actually evolves to beautiful fabrics and beautiful tapestry that you just mentioned. And that was a really interesting idea. And also for when I was writing for the string instruments in particular, especially for the duo, I felt string instruments can be very treated as a mecha instrument as well as two separate instruments as well. So in a way, when you're writing a string duo, you might have some challenges and you might have some specific advantages to write for string duo. Can you elaborate when you are having those can you elaborate those experiences that you had when you were writing this piece?
Yeah, and now that you're talking to me about the specific challenges of writing for duo, it reminds me that actually I was somewhat surprised when I was hearing some parts of this piece, because in my head, I think a duo felt kind of small, as an instrumentation, but actually I was pleasantly surprised at some moments. I think especially at the end of the second panel, that with the C octaves and the viola, and that the sound actually was incredibly resonant and very full, sometimes in a way that sounded very loud, actually, in a way that so that was a pleasant surprise for me. Was I wanted that feeling of fullness, but I didn't know how full it would actually get, and it was satisfying to me. But yes, you're right that there are these moments when you have a string quartet, for example, you have so many, it's easy to create so many situations. I mean, it's not easy to write a string quartet, but it's easy to, you could have one instrument in the front and everybody else accompanying, or you could have two duos. I mean, there's a million situations that you could invent, but with the duo, you seem to have less resources at first. So how do you use those resources, right? So yeah, there were definitely times in the beginning when I wanted both of them working together to create those textures. And of course, part of the idea of that opening is that the two work together to create, you hear the four notes that they build up, but it's not really about a scale in that moment. It's really about that vibrating kind of little wall of sound that they create together, right? So in a way, the four notes are often always there, but their level of importance in relationship to what's happening in the music shifts. Sometimes it's just there as an excuse to create that texture, and sometimes it's actually motivically important. And then there are times when, once that material dissolves into the faster scales, that then I think they trade playing melodies over the scale, and there's more of a sense of accompaniment and melody, or accompaniment foreground and background. And in the beginning, there's certainly not a foreground and background. It's just this one rich panel of sound. So yeah, I think you're right that throughout the piece, that shifts between these relationships of them working together, cooperating to create texture, and then sometimes somebody coming out in front and somebody receding to the background. I don't know if there are other relationships. I'm trying to think if there are other, besides melody or sort of foreground and background and kind of cooperation. Is there another one? I'm not really sure.
Thank you so much for your answers. And I'm going to move on to some general questions about your composition process and your philosophy. So first of all, what piece are you working on currently, and what is your huge influences right now for you?
So at the moment, I'm working on two pieces. One of them has a deadline and one of them doesn't. So I'm working right now on the one with the deadline because the deadline is starting to get closer. And that's a percussion concerto for an orchestra in Ohio, and a young percussionist actually who went to Eastman for his master's named Cameron Leach. Does anybody know Cameron by any chance? I think he finished a couple years ago. So I actually grew up in Ohio, but then I was at Eastman and a few other places in the world, and I never thought I would necessarily return to Ohio, but for this, then I got this position at Kent State. So I found myself back in my home state. And Cameron is also from Ohio, and he was actually adjuncting at Kent State when I first got here in 2018. And he came up to me and he said, "Hey, would you write me a percussion concerto?" And I said, "Yeah, but can you go find an orchestra?" And I thought I would never really hear from him again. And then he called me a few months later and said, "Hey, there's this like little local orchestra called the New Albany Symphony Orchestra, and like they're going to do it, and we found a little money to pay you." And I said, "Fantastic." So I didn't really expect that, but then this piece became a reality. So I had to actually start thinking about how to write a percussion concerto. So that's what I'm working on right now. And, you know, writing a percussion concerto is interesting because there's actually a lot of them from the past 20, 30 years. A lot of composers have written a percussion concerto, and it's sort of a distinctly modern genre, isn't it? Like, I mean, people didn't really write percussion concertos 120 years ago. I don't think I mean, there might be like a timpani concerto at some point, but so there's so much you can do, of course, with the soloist and the relationship with the soloist to the orchestra. It's a challenge to write this piece, but I have finished the first movement, and I've sketched most of the third movement actually, and half of the second movement. So I'm sort of writing it in pieces. I'm kind of not going straight through, and it's going to be 4 movements. And then I'm also writing this piece called Songs of Loss for a soprano named Sharon Harms, who I've known for about 10 years. And when I first heard Sharon's voice 10 years ago, I thought, I have to write for this person. She, you know, you meet these performers, and I was telling her for all these years, I'm going to write for you. And I think she doesn't believe me anymore, but because I've waited so long to actually write this piece. But I want to write her this. I want to write a piece for her that's a long piece, you know, like Pierrot length piece that's maybe 40 minutes, because I feel like she's such an amazing soprano. And the reason it's called Songs of Loss is that well, first of all, I'm sort of interested in ideas around loss. I mean, just not necessarily tangible loss of like a person, although that also, but just the idea of transience, kind of the Buddhist idea of transience, and the idea that we all are transients, and that we all have to deal with transience, which is one of those facts of life that we all have to, that we all confront. So that kind of uncomfortable feeling that sometimes we have in relationship to the transience, sometimes we can accept it. And the piece is really about our relationship to that. And so I've actually written a text myself, and I think it's going to be about 10 songs. So that's what I'm working on now, and it's for soprano and instruments, like 8 instruments. So
Thank you for sharing your current projects that you're working on. And I also have, this is my personal questions that I had always whenever I'm interviewing with somebody. When I met Helmut Lachenmann, he was saying that we as a composer, someone who is making an art, we also have to think about where we are going by writing our music. And he also questioned me, like, why am I composing as a composer? Because what we are writing is not necessarily sometimes related to the audiences, like mass of our audiences as well. So I want to ask you, like, what motivates you as a composer to write up pieces, or where you are going as a composer?
yeah, it's a really important question, isn't it? And I know that Helmut Lachenmann has thought a lot about that in relationship to history and culture. And yeah, I mean, I think that the first and foremost reason is simply because I think at one time or another that we've all, if we're composers, we've all felt that spark of just wanting to do it, that desire. We want to be close to music. There's something very, innate in us. Music has become very important to us at some time. And by writing music, it brings us, into our own experience and our own thoughts and our own selves in a very deep way. So I think, for me, that's really probably the first motivation, is that there's such a richness, it's such a rich experience to explore how your own being, comes up with music, but that's only one part of the answer to your question, because the answer that I think Lachenmann was really asking about is, what is our responsibility in a way as composers in culture, and each one of us has to find that for ourselves, and I think in some ways, I don't want to say the answer is more straightforward for Lachenmann than it might be for some of us, but I think Lachenmann knows that he comes out of a German tradition that has a very clear sense of lineage to it. I mean, we know, of course, all of the great old German composers. I mean, in a way, classical music is in very large part of German history, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, French and English and Italian, et cetera. But I mean, when we think about Bach and Brahms and Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart, it's a German-Austrian. I mean, there's quite a bit of contribution from the German-Austrian tradition. And if you consider yourself part of that, and if you've come after Schoenberg and Webern and Berg and these composers and Darmstadt, and you consider yourself part of this lineage, then I think probably Lachenmann feels a very strong responsibility to continue to make music for that culture within that line of thinking that continues to open up new spaces and that doesn't allow people to just be comfortable with classical music as an art of entertainment, and that continues to push boundaries in different ways. And I agree with many of those principles for myself and for all of us. I think that in a way that we should be striving to write music that questions and that considers our relationship carefully to culture. But I also think that the issues, for example, for me as someone from Ohio and the United States, is quite different, because I don't necessarily own, German history in the same way that Lachenmann does. For me, as an American, in some ways, I don't feel like I have a very clear history that I own, that I know that I come from. I mean, we have composers like Charles Ives, who to me are very American composers who are great ancestors in a way. But I also consider people like John Coltrane an ancestor. We have this wonderful tradition of jazz artists who to me were sometimes making music at the very highest level. It's a very, very diverse set of we have a very diverse history that's complicated. And to me, I don't feel like it's a straightforward thing to understand how to relate to culture in a way that's meaningful. So I think for myself, I feel that it's very important to sort of take an Emersonian point of view of self-reliance and, you know, listen to the world with great interest and curiosity, but then find a music that feels authentic to me, even if it is living, as I've talked about with some of these pieces, with the mess of different influences and trying to let that be honest for myself. And I think the one thing that we do have to really think about in this country is capitalism, because it's so dominating everything. And, you know, the idea of making money is so, I mean, it's such a bottom line for so many activities. And while it's nice to make money, you know, for our music, whether it's from a commission fee or whether it's from a royalty or whatever, that's certainly not the primary motivation for us. I mean, you know, for most of us, I think. I mean, otherwise we would be stupid to go into this field. We should go be a banker or something. It's not the most efficient way to make money, right? So, so I do think that the primary motivation for me is much more something like trying to find some integrated, honest response to all of the complexity of myself and of my relationship to the world, and then to try to put that out there in some way and hope that, you know, that's meaningful to, you know, for somebody, you know, at the end of the day. And but there's so, again, as you know, there's just so much richness from going through that process yourself that even if it ends up not being very meaningful, there's a lot to gain from just doing it yourself as well. But of course, you know, it's great to hear music performed. I mean, I do think that I do have a very strong desire to hear it, you know, with the instruments at the end. That's very important. Whether it's actually, you know, whether it's actually like very well received or something is maybe of lesser concern. It's more important to me that I get to hear it and that it makes it's sort of satisfying to finish the process with the piece. I don't know if any of that made sense. I felt, you know, like I was going in different directions, but those are some of the thoughts that occurred to me in response to your question.
Thank you so much for sharing your idea. And this is going to be our last questions for the day. And it's going to be very interesting questions, so be ready. So if you can go back when you were a student of Eastman, what would you do as a student? And is there any tip of advice for current students who are going through this pandemic?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, Eastman was such a great experience for me. And I found that Eastman was this just great environment that was, on the one hand, a very high level. You know, you sort of trusted that everybody who was there was very good at what they did. And at the same time, it was very diverse. I mean, the composition student body at the time was extremely diverse. There were some students who were interested in writing very, very complex atonal music, and there were students who were writing kind of post-punk minimalism. I mean, it was just all over the place and a little competitive, but also very supportive. And so I found that the diversity and sort of was extremely inspiring just to be around that kind of diversity, which is not something that I feel like I've experienced in every other environment that I've been in. And I also found that there was such an enthusiasm on the part of some of the very best players in the school to play new music. You know, I mean, and also Brad Lubman, who's still there, was a very important part of my education. He would, you know, conduct everybody from, you know, Charles Warren and Yanis Xenakis and Steve Reich, and you would hear all this music live at school. So that was really great. So I would say definitely being able to collaborate in that environment with your colleagues. I would just tell you, like, just go write pieces for your colleagues and get them played while you're there. It's such a wonderful experience. In terms of the pandemic, yeah, it's such a hard question that is, we all have to find ways of, you know, of making this time meaningful for us, or trying to find ways of continuing to meaningfully move forward. You know, I think the pandemic is a marathon, but I don't think it's going to last forever. I mean, I think there are creative things you can do now, like writing pieces and having people sort of patch pieces together with video and whatnot. That could be very satisfying too if you want to do that. But I think it's also maybe, you know, an opportunity to just be quiet within ourselves and not always be worried about getting our pieces into the world, and to just reflect on our music and be ready to go. You know, this is a great time to sort of do some internal reflection and write some pieces and get ready to write more pieces. So for us as composers, it can be a productive time.
Thank you so much. I think we are all good for today. And thank you, first of all, thank you so much on behalf of all of us, as well as Eastman students. And I'm looking forward to listen your percussion concerto. If there is a live stream, please share with us. And maybe David, if you have anything to say about.
I also want to thank Adam for being with us, and I'm very happy that I had listened to the interview and I thought it was terrific, and the questions were excellent. I know that you had gathered questions from all the students who had had a chance to review Adam's pieces, and so you did a really great job organizing that and making your presentation, and it was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I loved Eastman. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Eastman, and I am jealous of all of you for getting to be there. And thank you so much for all the really, really thoughtful questions. It was really great interacting with you all.
Thank you.